welcome back to Research Done Right. In today's lesson, Lesson 7, we're going to be learning about survey research. If you remember in Lesson 6, we talked about observational research methods. Those methodologies were heavily rooted in qualitative collection of data. And so survey research is slightly different because it's going to focus more on the quantitative way to collect data. So the first thing we'll do is we'll clarify the difference between qualitative and quantitative research methods. And then we'll spend some time talking about the purpose of surveys. When should you conduct a survey? When should you not? And what types of questions are surveys used to answer? Then we'll talk about important factors that you need to know when you construct your own surveys. And we'll extend that further into understanding how to analyze the results of a survey. Lastly, we'll wrap up our discussion by talking about how you can administer surveys, and we'll talk about the importance of sampling when it comes to survey distribution. So for starters, let's quickly recap the difference between quantitative and qualitative research methods. Remember, quantitative methods involve a numeric representation of user data. So this is things that basically you can count, things that users could rate. Ultimately, we're collecting a lot of numerical data so that we can then analyze it using statistical analyses and find significance or significant relationships between variables. When it comes to qualitative measures, we're more interested in understanding the behavior itself and why it's happening. So in other words, instead of collecting numerical data, what we're doing is collecting verbatims, anecdotes by using interviews, talking to people, focus groups, etc. And ultimately, things that are verbal, we have to code into some quantifiable measurement. But ultimately, the qualitative data or the qualitative research approach focuses on collecting a lot of information from a small group of people, while quantitative information collects high-level information, but from a large group of people. So depending on the research question you have and the types of answers that you're looking for, that will determine whether you should use a quantitative approach or a qualitative approach. When it comes to surveys, we of course know that that is a quantitative research method. So the quantitative research approach focuses on behaviors that can be counted. Typically, surveys will involve a large sample size. Remember, because our goal is to statistically analyze our data, we need to have statistical power. And we know that statistical power comes from large sample sizes. So ultimately, the conclusions that we draw are based on our statistical analyses of these data. So for example, using a survey to assess participant satisfaction with a particular course using a rating scale of 1 to 5. 1 to 5 are numeric anchors, so therefore it gives us a quantitative approach. In qualitative research, on the other hand, we tend to focus on people behaving in natural settings. And in fact, we often use qualitative research in the field for naturalistic observation. And generally, the qualitative research approach includes smaller samples in more limited settings. But with the qualitative research approach, we're able to collect more in-depth information using interviews, discussions, focus groups, etc. And so the conclusions that we draw from qualitative research approaches are based on the interpretations of all of these verbal exchanges that we've had with our participants. So in other words, the researchers have to use their own perception, and sometimes that could be subjective, of the behaviors that they're observing. For example, going back to the same question about rating a course, in a quantitative way, we would give people a survey and say, hey, rate this course from 1 to 5. But in a qualitative approach, we would actually have a discussion with a small group of people from the course and ask them to explain why they like or dislike the course. So again, we have a smaller sample size. We have only 8 people from, let's say, a class of 100. But we are able to have a more in-depth conversation about why they like it or dislike it. Whereas with a survey, we would be able to collect 100 surveys and 100 ratings of the course, but we wouldn't really be able to understand why they gave the rating that they did. So for the remainder of this lecture, we're going to focus only on the quantitative research approach and surveys in particular. So why do we conduct surveys? What is the point of them, and how do we know when we should use them? Well, the purpose of a survey is to gather a small amount of data from a large amount of people. We call this collecting research at scale. So ultimately, if we want to show importance in the numbers, show power in the numbers, then you would conduct a survey. Typically, surveys are used in addition to some type of qualitative study or experimental method. And a survey could be administered before or after the experimental study. It really depends on the information that you're looking to collect. So surveys help us understand the what, but not the why, right? So the qualitative studies help us understand the why. So for example, if I was interested in understanding why people prefer to watch video content that was live as opposed to watching something that was live but at a later time, like pre-recorded live, but you're watching it at a later time. So ultimately my question becomes, what's the type of content that people care to watch live in the moment, and what type of content do people care to watch later when, even though it aired live at one point, but they could watch it later after it's already aired. So I might throw out a survey, just to put out some feelers to understand. Perhaps I get my results back and I see that something like the news, the participants feel like they want to watch live and in the moment, but something like a cooking show, they prefer to watch later, even though it aired live at some point. So based on the data I collect from the survey, I can then use that, narrow it down, change my hypothesis and research question, and then conduct some type of qualitative measurement or laboratory study in which I can further expand on my original research question. So survey research involves the usage of questionnaires and interviews to ask people to provide information about themselves. So the most important thing here to understand is that a survey is used to collect information on participants' attitudes or beliefs, or their demographic information, for example, their age, gender, marital status, etc. We can also use surveys to collect information on user behaviors. So if you can think of some examples of surveys, one that comes to mind is, for example, at the end of every semester, all of the students in the university are asked to answer a variety of questions about the class that they were in and their professor, and basically give a rating of their experience in the class. So that is administered using a survey. Any type of quizzes that you take online on social media, that's an example of a survey. The census would be an example of a survey. Let's say you take your car in to get serviced to a dealership, then they'll send you a satisfaction survey to see how satisfied you are with the services that their employees provided for you. I mean, the list goes on and on, but anytime you are asked to provide your opinion on something or your belief or, measure some type of behavior, that would be an example of a survey. And so surveys help researchers study relationships among variables. So the word relationships, if you still haven't watched lecture 4 on fundamental research issues, I highly encourage you to watch that before you create your own survey. So the reason behind that is that typically when we do experimental research, we are looking for causal relationships. We want to see that an independent variable is causing a dependent variable to happen. In other words, we see some changes in the dependent variable as a result of what we are doing in terms of manipulation to the independent variable. However, in causal relationships, we like to have what is called experimental control, and we also need to have internal validity, right? We need to be able to control for any sort of extraneous variables. And our causal conclusions are based strictly on observations that we make in a very controlled laboratory setting. When it comes to surveys, surveys can never give us causal relationship information. So what we do is we call them correlational relationships. So when we talked about the difference, I believe also in lecture 4, of non-experimental versus experimental methods, a survey would be an example of a non-experimental method because you are not providing any sort of treatment, any sort of levels of the independent variable to see how participants would behave as the outcome. On the contrary, a survey, basically, you are placing all of the responsibility on the participant to provide you with information, while you as the researcher are not manipulating anything. So just wanted to clarify before we move forward that anytime you use a survey as your main method of research, that it can only be correlational and can never be causational or causal. So related to that point, we have the common assumption that people are willing to provide truthful and accurate answers. But what we have realized is that participants develop what is called a response set. A response set is the tendency to respond to all questions from one particular perspective. So for example, if you're asking participants a question about how social they feel, and question 1 says, on a scale of 1 to 5, I feel like I have many friends, and they'll say 5. The second question might be, on a scale of 1 to 5, I feel lonely. And if the participant circles the 5 again and continues to constantly answer from the yes or the no perspective, or the 1 or the 5 perspective, without really paying attention to the context of the question, that is called what a response set. Another thing to watch out for is social desirability. Social desirability is basically trying to look like a better person to the researcher. So this leads the individual to answer in the most socially acceptable way. In quotes, faking that you are good. Not to say that the participants are not good, but in terms of asking questions like, how many speeding tickets have you gotten in the past 2 years? Obviously, getting a speeding ticket is not something to be proud of, and so people may lie just to look more socially desirable. In other words, to look like they definitely observe traffic rules, they're good drivers, etc. And so some people tend to underreport undesirable behaviors and overreport desirable behaviors. Does this mean that we should suspect everyone of being a liar? No, but it's just another limitation to be aware of if you are using a survey as your main form of data collection. Okay, so let's say that you are convinced that you want to use a survey to collect your data. Here are some things that you need to know about constructing a survey. The first and most important thing is to define your research objectives. What specifically is it that you want to know? And it's really important to stay on topic. You don't want to ask too many questions, and you also don't want to ask questions unrelated to your research question. So remember, surveys are used to collect information on attitudes and beliefs. They are not looking for cause and effect relationships. They're more looking for perceptions of how people think or feel about a certain topic. So basically, you're evaluating how people think or perceive certain issues. You can also focus your survey around facts and demographics. In terms of facts and demographics, sometimes you are interested to know the gender, age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, medical history, etc. of your participants. In a lot of cases, even when we use experimental methods, because we want to understand our sample, we do collect demographic information about our participants using something like a demographic survey. And when using a survey to collect information on behaviors, you can focus on past or future behaviors. But again, you generally try to put a participant in a particular mindset, like imagine you were doing X, how would you react to this? Or think back to, the last time that you went to the grocery store, how anxious did you feel during the pandemic, etc. So you can definitely gauge information about behaviors, but you just need to provide the context to the participants so that they can understand, what mindset they should be in when answering your particular question. Now, question wording is a really, really important part of constructing a good survey. So it's really important to consider to use the best questions when you are putting them together. You want to avoid unfamiliar or technical terms. You want to avoid vague or imprecise terms. You also want to make sure that your sentences are following the rules of grammar, so avoid ungrammatical sentence structure. And keep your questions and your phrases short, because once the phrases become too long, it overloads the participants' working memory. They forget, by the end of the question how the question even started. So just make sure that you keep your questions short and concise. and try not to overload their working memory. Also, don't embed the questions with misleading information. So now that we talked about the issues that we want to avoid, let's talk about how we can avoid them and best practices for creating your survey. So you want to make sure that your survey focuses on simplicity. So the language should be easily understandable. Do not use jargon, slang, right, or extremely technical terms. So you really need to think about who your participants are who will be reading your survey and filling it out. Of course, it totally depends on what your research question is, and it totally depends on your screening criteria for who you accept to be in your particular research study. However, regardless of those type of things, you need to make sure that any person who is involved in your study will be able to read it and understand it. So try not to use very large words or words that are not very common among the lexicon of your participants. You also want to provide a brief explanation or definition of your terms. So for example, if you are asking someone their opinion about a particular proposition in terms of politics, like Proposition J, before you ask them, what is your opinion on Proposition J? Do you agree or disagree with it? You should probably give an example or a definition, rather, of what Proposition J is. So prior to asking the rating question, you could say, Proposition J is defined as blah, blah, and blah. Please indicate how you agree or disagree with this particular initiative. So that's basically what we mean by providing a brief explanation or a definition of your term. You also want to avoid double-barreled questions. So a double-barreled question means you're asking two things at once. For example, should senior citizens be given more money for recreation centers and food assistance programs? What's the problem with this question? Well, for one, you're asking about whether senior citizens should be given more money for recreation centers, but in the same question, you're asking if they should be given more money for food assistance programs. Generally, food is more important than recreation, so then as the participant, you're conflicted and you don't know how to answer this because perhaps you agree with one of the programs, but you don't agree with the other. So instead of putting these two in one double-barreled question, you need to separate them into two different questions because the two items are not related. You also want to avoid loaded questions. Loaded questions lead people to respond in a certain way because you've used words that are really emotionally charged. So remember, when you craft your survey, you want to make sure that you use neutral behavior-based terminology. So for example, you wouldn't want to ask, how would you rate the awful situation we are in given online learning, right? Using the word awful, it makes it a loaded question because you're charging it with an emotional word. So remove all emotion from your questions and imagine that you are completely neutral and you don't have any feelings whatsoever when you come up with your research questions. The other thing to avoid is negative wording. Basically, you want to avoid phrasing questions with negatives. So for example, do you feel the city should not approve women's shelters? Instead of saying, do you feel the city should not approve, you probably would ask, should the city approve women's shelters? Or how do you feel about the city approving women's shelters? But including the word not makes it negatively worded, and that is confusing to people when they read it. And then we have avoiding yay saying or nay saying. So basically, yay saying means yes, nay saying means no. Avoid using only agree or only disagree responses because you really want to make sure that the people are reading the questions. So going back to my first example of the fact, let's say you're interested in measuring how social people are, and one of your questions would be, I have many friends. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being not disagree, 5 being agree. That person, if they were social and they had friends, they would label it closer to the 5 because they would agree. And then you might want to have some reverse coded questions in the sense that like the context of the question, actually, if they were feeling social, they would answer a 1 instead of a 5, the minimum instead of the maximum. For example, most of the time I feel lonely. If the participant answered 5, again, strongly agree, that would contradict question 1 about having many friends. So again, this reverse coding, throwing some of these into your survey, will ensure that the participants are actually reading your questions and giving you accurate data. Because if you notice that participants are giving you the same answer from top to bottom, that's kind of a good sign that they're not really reading and they're doing that response set activity that we talked about earlier. Okay, so imagine that you've constructed your survey, now you're ready to finalize it. So just take one last glance at it before you administer it to people and make sure that it looks professional. Did you type it out cleanly? Are your margins equal everywhere? Do you have the same amount of space between all of your anchors? You want to make sure you have no spelling or grammar errors. You want to make sure that the participants can locate your response alternatives, the answer choices, right? So you don't want to have your question appear and the response choices really far below. You want to keep them right underneath the question. You also want to leave enough space between each question because, again, reading question after question after question will be hard on the participants' eyes. And you also want to stay consistent with rating scales. So if you're going to choose a 7-point Likert scale, use that all the way through. If you're going to use a 5-point Likert scale, then keep that consistent. Don't jump between 5 and 7 and 3. It also is a little bit taxing on the participants that way. You also want to consider the sequence in which you're going to pose your questions. So depending on how many questions you have, again, you want to keep it to as minimal questions as possible as you need to get your data. But participants do get tired and they don't want to be tired and you don't want them to be tired when they answer your questions. So really think about putting the important questions that you want first. And maybe if you have multiple questions that you consider important and they're revolving around a similar topic, you should group them together so that participants can, again, move through different mindsets as they're answering your questions and so that it's easier for them. Ultimately, you want to do what makes it easiest for the participants so that they stay motivated and they stay engaged in providing you all of the data that you are asking them to provide. Something else that you might want to do is pilot test your survey on a small group of people. This could be family, friends, etc. So you don't necessarily need to use their data from the survey, but it's really good to have a fresh pair of eyes look over your survey. And actually, as participants, they can give you feedback if certain words didn't make sense to them, if they felt there were too many questions or too few questions, if they felt that the font was too small, if any of the anchors were confusing. So ultimately, every time you create a new survey, it's very helpful to just do a test run on a couple different people so that they can give you feedback from a totally objective standpoint. Okay, so imagine you have crafted your survey and now you need to think about how you're going to analyze the responses from the survey. Well, we do have two different types of responses. We have closed-ended responses and we have open-ended responses. So a closed-ended response on a survey means you're giving the participants a limited number of choices from which they can choose, right? There's a limited number of response alternatives that are given to them. The pros of this is that it's more structured, it's easier to code for you as the researcher, and it's also faster to get responses from participants. So when we say closed-ended, we mean things like yes or no, multiple choice questions, things like that. Open-ended questions, on the other hand, are kind of like if you think about short responses or paragraph form or in which the participants need to write something. So people are free to answer in any way they like. And so they could, this is helpful because they could give you more detailed insights into how they're thinking and why they chose the response that they did. The downside to this is that the open-ended questions definitely take more time, and so sometimes participants don't take that time to give you that feedback, or perhaps they don't feel comfortable writing out a longer response. However, the best thing to do, in my opinion, is to create a survey that's predominantly consists of closed-ended questions, but you definitely have open-ended questions at the end or, sporadically throughout the survey that are optional, in which participants can give you more information to justify their answers for the closed-ended questions. So typically when we analyze our responses, we give participants rating scales. And these rating scales are typically used to measure how much judgments. For example, how much agreement or disagreement participants feel, how confident or unconfident they feel, how satisfied or not satisfied they feel. So ultimately answering how much questions. And we can obtain information on the participants' evaluation, activity, and potency. So when we use rating scales, we could have Likert scales, as we've talked about, but we can also have a dichotomy. So basically having only two answer choices. For example, yes or no, agree or disagree. In other instances, if you want more quantitative data, then you can use a 5 or a 7-point Likert scale, and you would label your anchors from extreme to extreme. So from strongly disagree to strongly agree, or not confident at all to very confident. And why do we use 5 or 7? So the idea is that you want to make sure that you use an odd number of anchors for your answer choices so that participants are able to choose a middle or neutral option. If we use an even number, then the participants are forced to either skew to the downside or to the upside. And having a neutral response, kind of to be in the middle or on the fence, disappears. Now, some researchers purposely avoid having a neutral measure, but generally it's more accepted to include a neutral measure or to have like a middle baseline that participants can choose when answering your survey. So for example, we can have a Likert scale with 7 anchors to answer a question like students in the university should be required to pass a comprehensive examination to graduate. And then on a scale of 1 to 7, they can mark if they strongly agree or strongly disagree. Similarly, you can have a 5-point Likert scale and ask about how confident someone is that the defendant is guilty of the crime. So 1 being not at all confident and 5 being very confident. And you could also ask a question about frequency of behavior, right? How often do you exercise for at least 20 minutes? And here we have 5 answer choices: less than twice a week, about twice a week, about 4 times a week, about 6 times a week, and at least once a day. So again, given this last example, we don't have a neutral base, right? Because we're asking how often they exercise. And if they exercise never, then they would choose the first one, less than twice a week. But in this case, about 4 times a week would be the middle level between people who don't exercise at all and those who exercise frequently. And then we also have drawings that we can use as response alternatives. So like smiley faces. So this is an example of rating a customer satisfaction survey with the red sad face being very poor, and we see the negative sign. And we have a green happy face indicating excellent. They have a lot of satisfaction, and a plus sign on the right-hand side. So sometimes when you're doing research with kids who are not able to read yet, for example, or maybe you go to the doctor and you're trying to understand how much pain a particular child has, they could point to a particular smiley face to show the extent or the degree of their pain. So this is something to think about, especially if you're doing research with people who don't speak the language fluently in which your survey is being conducted. Or perhaps if you're asking about something that about words that are not universally known, right? So maybe the terminology that you're using for your anchors is not very clear. So using something like pictures is also an option. Okay, so how should we administer surveys? How do we get participants to answer our surveys? Well, there are 2 main ways to administer surveys. The first way is to print them and distribute them, or now, as we know, is more popular, to distribute them online. The other version is to conduct interviews. So if we think about the first option, using questionnaires, this is definitely the cheaper option. It's less costly. It also allows participants to stay anonymous, and this is important because, going back to our concept of social desirability, if participants feel like they remain anonymous and the researcher's not in front of them asking them the questions, maybe they're more inclined to tell the truth and be honest. However, the questionnaires, again, require reading comprehension. So we want to make sure that the participants can read before they sign up to be in your survey, especially because the researcher is typically not there to moderate the questions, right? You typically send the survey online or you hand it to them. they complete it and they hand it back to you. There's not much interaction between the researcher and the participant. Given that information, sometimes participants can get demotivated because the survey is boring, because there are too many questions. And so they may abandon the survey completely or fill out only half of it, which is bad news for you as the researcher, because you definitely want a complete sample of all of the information and questions answered that you're asking. We do see especially low response rates for surveys that are mailed. So you are probably guilty of this. When you see a survey come in the mail, you kind of whoosh and throw it in the trash. So yeah, typically mailed surveys don't have a good response rate. However, online surveys are increasingly popular. And so probably today, if you're stuck in a research methods class doing Zoom lectures, then you're probably going to be one of the students who are forced to conduct your experiment remotely or virtually. And so it becomes a quasi-experiment, because now all you can do is send a survey to a variety of different participants and see how that data correlates, which again, it's not a problem. It's just another type of methodology. But ultimately, when you do send a survey online, the participants can't ask the researcher for clarification if they don't understand something. And so we also can't control for ineligible or false information. So is it possible that people will lie? Yes. Should we not consider their data? No, not necessarily. But again, it's just a limitation to be aware of. If we talk about interviews as far as survey or data collection goes, response rates do tend to be higher. So when we say interview, this is kind of like, imagine that, when you go to the mall, people kind of stop you and they're like, oh, would you like to sample our new fragrance or our new cosmetics, etc., or our new, cell phone cover? And then an exchange of dialogue begins. So it's easier to not complete a survey that is mailed to you or not complete a link to an online survey than it is to actually walk away from someone who's physically talking to you. So that's why the response rates tend to be higher when the researcher is interviewing the person live. They're also less likely to leave questions unanswered if someone else is there to kind of lead and moderate the survey. But you have to be aware of interviewer bias. So what is interviewer bias? Well, when we have face-to-face interviews, it means the interviewer and the respondent meet to conduct the particular interview and provide the data. Interviewer bias can occur if you are present in the physical same location as your participant. So perhaps between participant 1 and participant 2, the way you act will change. Perhaps you smiled at the first person, which made them want to complete your study, but you didn't smile at the second person, which perhaps put them in a bad mood and they completed your study, but they didn't do it as naturally or honestly as possible. So you as the interviewer are introducing this type of bias, right? So you want to make sure that you behave exactly the same way with all of the participants from whom you are collecting your data. This method is typically used for a smaller sample size. So if you think of a focus group, this would be a good example of a face-to-face interview in a smaller group of people. You can also have a telephone interview, right? This is less expensive than a face-to-face interview. It also allows you to collect data quickly, because while you're on the phone asking, participants a particular question, you can immediately input their data into your computer, into your data log. And that brings us to our last topic of sampling. Now, we remember that it is virtually impossible to collect information from an entire population. So what we do is we take samples from larger populations and we run research on them. So when we have probability sampling, this means that each member of the population has a specifiable probability of being chosen. In other words, everyone has a fair chance. And so what we do is we use random sampling in order to ensure that the participants in our sample are actually representative of the larger population. By doing random sampling, we are controlling for individual differences and ultimately hoping that the people in our sample will be a good representation of the larger population. We can also have stratified random sampling, right? Which is involved in coming up with a specific criteria and then conducting research on the participants who meet that criteria or meet that strata level. So for example, if you were looking to conduct research on siblings, you would probably need to screen out people who are only children and not use them for your study. But then once you've filtered out those who do have siblings, then you go ahead and conduct a random sample on that particular strata, on that particular filter. And the other type of sampling we have is non-probability sampling, right? So the probability of any member of the population to be chosen is unknown. And this is related to convenience sampling. So again, given the situation that we are in now, or even when we were in the university in person, it was very common for lower division psychology students to be required to participate in experiments of upper division psychology students, such as yourself, for some type of class credit. So that is called a convenience sample. It is convenient to use that particular type of, those particular types of participants in order to collect your data. So this could possibly introduce bias, but more importantly, it also affects your ability to generalize. So you can only generalize your research findings to the extent of the types of participants you had. We also have purposive sampling, in which participants must meet a certain criteria. And we also have quota sampling, which is the same as stratified sampling, but it does not use random sampling after you've filtered them out. It uses convenience sampling. So perhaps you're a researcher and you're interested in investigating the relationship between being an only child or having siblings and how that correlates with academic success. So what you would have to do is, for the entire university, you would probably launch this screener, and you would want people to mark whether they're an only child or if they have siblings. Based on that criteria, you're going to filter out the people who mentioned that they're an only child, and you will only be left with those who have siblings. Instead of conducting a random sample on those people, what you do is you take a convenience sample, and you only use the participants, for example, in the psych department, because you know all of their emails and it's just easier for you to contact them. So that would be an example of quota sampling. You started with stratified sampling, but then from that stratified sample, you conducted a convenience sample. This is different from stratified random sampling, because after you filtered out the criteria that you're interested in, then you went ahead and you conducted a random sample. So remember, whenever you conduct any type of research, whether it's experimental or non-experimental, you really have to think about who your participants will be, because that will directly affect your external validity and your ability to generalize to people who match the demographics of your participants, who match the same type of participants that you had in your study. So that brings us to the end of our lecture. Just as a recap, in this lecture, we talked about the differences between qualitative and quantitative research methods. We spent most of our time focusing on the quantitative research method known as survey research, and we understood that surveys are mainly conducted to collect information on participants' attitudes, beliefs, or past or future behaviors. So survey research can only tell you about how variables are related to each other, but they cannot tell you how one variable causes the other. And last but not least, please make sure that when you are crafting your own surveys, you are sticking to those important factors like simplicity, avoiding loaded questions, avoiding double-barreled questions, and all of those great best practices that we talked about in this lecture. So good luck with all of your own survey creations, and I will see you next time on Research Done Right. Thank you so much for watching.